Ping pong, Mr. Randall.
All right, so we got to detente. Did we get to the Russian grain deal? Yeah. All right, so we got to the Russian grain deal, and then we got to the ambassadors talking in Warsaw between Chinese and Americans. Yes.
When we were talking about the detente, you mentioned the Russian grain deal, which is a big leap on the timeline, but we didn't cover all the stuff in between.
We're gonna cover it all right now, for sure. All right, so they meet in Warsaw. They start talking. Everything's great. Then what happens? That kind of like everything changes. There's this huge ping pong tournament in Japan. I know you're all thinking ping pong, but it's not exactly like, I don't know, the World Series or the Super Bowl. It's ping pong. But it is an international tournament where representatives from all the countries get together and compete for the table tennis championship of the world. So Americans go, the Chinese are there, all kinds of different countries are there. But the star story is when an American and a Chinese team member are kind of volleying. This is before the official tournament begins. So one day they're just kind of volleying back and forth, and they're playing back and forth, and they're both so caught up in like their game that the American doesn't notice that his entire team is headed back to the hotel. So when these guys are done, the American's like, all right, and he's like, where is everyone? He's like, oh, they're all gone. He's like, oh man, I guess I'll just take a cab or whatever. And the Chinese guy's like, why don't you just come with us, like on our bus, because we're staying at the hotel. And the American's like, all right. So people there see the American get on board the Chinese bus heading to the hotel, and everyone's like, ugh. And so it's like, Twitter wasn't around, but had it been around, I don't think it could have been any faster. Because by the time the bus got to the hotel, there was a mob of reporters. And so as the American's walking off the bus, the reporter's like, so do you want to go visit China? And he's like, it'd be pretty cool to go visit a lot of countries. Yeah, but do you want to go visit China? And he's like, well, yeah, I think that'd be really cool. And everyone's like, ooh. So apparently, because the reporters were all there doing this, Mao finds out about it in China, and Mao gets on the phone and calls the coach of the Chinese team and says, invite the American to come to China, like the team to come to China after the tournament. And so the coach is like, and what are you going to say to Mao? Like, no. Like, okay. So their coach talks to our coach about the American team coming to China. And our coach is like, I have to check because travel to China is forbidden in the U.S. So he like calls his people who call the people who call Nixon, and Nixon's like, yeah, absolutely. So after the tournament, the American ping pong team become the first Americans to travel to China since 1949. It's like the best. Yes.
You said it's forbidden?
It is forbidden. It isn't now. It was then. Absolutely. We're not allowed to travel to any communist country.
Oh.
Just like today you can't travel to China. Well, I'm sorry. You can't travel to... Well, and now you actually can travel to Cuba. North Korea, you can't travel to North Korea. Don't go to North Korea. But at the time, it was forbidden everywhere. Like, you couldn't travel to any communist country. So, after this, then, our relationship kind of shifts. Now remember, Nixon's still looking at the tension between the USSR and the Chinese. So Nixon formally recognizes China. Now the only other communist country we have ever formally recognized was the USSR during World War II, and that was Roosevelt. We haven't formally recognized, remember that means we accept them as is, any other country. So that was like a big deal that we formally recognized China, which I'm sure made Russia nervous. Because it seems like the Americans are allying ourselves with China, which right now there's a lot of tension between the USSR and them. So Brezhnev, or Khrushchev, let me think of the timeline, we're with Brezhnev, of the USSR, is like, we should really talk about nuclear weapons. And America's like, okay. So the SALT talks between the U.S. and the USSR are all about somehow putting like a cool down to the insane amount of nuclear weapons that we're both building, especially us. We have to outproduce the enemy. So we start talking about SALT. Now, it's election year in 1972. Nixon has done more to kind of ease the tension between us and the communist world and everyone else. But there is one thing left. No American has ever visited a communist country. So he visits China. And there's tons of pictures of him and Mao laughing, smoking cigars, having a drink. And he lifts the travel ban, so now you can travel to China. We start trade with China. We start this relationship with China that is unlike we have had in 21 years. At the same time, we're talking with the Soviet Union about not reducing the number of missiles we have. We're just trying to stop from building any more. So in 1972, he visits China. At the same time, he signs the SALT I agreement with the USSR. What SALT is going to do is it's going to set the number of missiles that we can each have at the 1972 level, which means we can't build more weapons than the number we have in 1972. That does not mean we are going to stop our research or continue to make better weapons. What that means is if we make a better missile, then we have to take an existing missile that we have and dismantle it and replace it with this missile. So the number of the missiles that we have never changes. It can't go up above the 1972 levels. So that'll keep us from amassing more and more weapons. We'll keep it at this level. The hope was the next step, SALT II, we could reduce the number of missiles that we have, but we're not there yet. Right now, this is like the first step. So by the end of 1972, I mean, we are at more world peace between us and the communist world than we haven't since Roosevelt. And so Nixon wins re-election very easily in 1972, even though he wasn't sure he was going to. But people are impressed with what he has done in the foreign policy world. All right, so the Russian radios and Nixon there in 1972 as well. That's when it becomes official. All right, so now Vietnam. I told you yesterday that he had to draft troops, which started a huge wave of protest again. But it was part of his big plan. The big plan was to build up their army so that ours can come home slowly. Well, by the time we get to 1972, it has been working. We have been building up the South Vietnamese army, and we have started to bring our troops home slowly, but they are starting to come home. So after he wins election, he decides to do just one last little push to end the war, and he just bombs the crap out of North Vietnam. 12 straight days of bombing. Over Christmas. We call them the Christmas bombings. Like, it's not Santa Claus, it's a bomb. So, I know, but it's true. All right, so, and after that, everyone's like, okay, we're all done. So in January of 73, we get a ceasefire in Vietnam. We all agree to stop fighting. There's no real a treaty that ends the war. We all just agree to stop fighting. So by March, all of our troops are home. Yay! Just on a side note, the fighting just stopped. Like, there's no more uprisings and stuff like that for right now. So we felt like it was a success at this moment because our troops are home and South Vietnam had not fallen to communism. Don't worry, they will, just not quite yet. We're not there yet. So then Brezhnev of the USSR, he visits the United States, and he and Nixon have this heart-to-heart where they both kind of don't want to start nuclear war because it would ensure your own destruction, but we've never formally discussed that with the USSR. So they're going to talk about how, you're not going to start a war, right? We're not going to kill ourselves, right? And I wasn't going to, I thought you were. No, we're not. So they both kind of agree that if things ever did get heated again, because right now we're in a good place. If things ever do get heated, we need to both make an agreement that it's not going to be nuclear. And so they both agree to that, and that kind of makes everyone kind of feel better. And we're in a good place right now, so yay, okay, that's good. All right, however, 1973 and 74 is also when Nixon becomes embroiled in one of the worst scandals in American history, Watergate. And it ends in his resignation in August of 1974. So Nixon resigns. That brings his brand new vice president, who he just appointed not that long ago, to the presidency. And Jerry Ford becomes president. And so now it's kind of on him to continue détente, which is his plan to do. But then he pardons Nixon of any possible crimes he may have committed, and America turns against our president. And so now he has a hard time. He's going to have a hard time getting anything through Congress because people are so mad at him. But that doesn't really have a lot to do with the Cold War, but it does for what happens next. In 1975, North Vietnam invades South Vietnam. Communist North Vietnam invades. Now, this is not an internal struggle. This is a country invading another country. Which means then, if we want to keep South Vietnam from becoming communist, we have to go back. If we go back, it will be the entire Vietnam War all over again. it will be more jungle warfare, more quagmire. Neither side's gonna win. It's gonna be awful. And the president had to make the decision, and protesters are coming out of the blue. Do not send our soldiers back there. Do not send them back there. And then Vietnam vets are coming out like, we have to go back, or else I lost my leg for nothing, or else we lost our people for nothing. And Ford had to make the decision. It's all on him. Like, do we go back or do we not? And he ultimately made the decision that we're not going back to Vietnam. I am not putting America through another Vietnam. And because we don't go, South Vietnam, there was no way they could withstand the North Vietnamese invasion. Within 2 months, South Vietnam will fall. And then South Vietnam is unified with North Vietnam into one country, a communist country, and we lost South Vietnam. This is why a lot of people say we lost the war, even though we weren't there. But that's what we went to defend, and we didn't go back. So not going back means we went there for nothing. And so that's kind of where we lost Vietnam, that whole idea comes from. But Vietnam is still communist today, by the way, one of the few nations still communist today. But soon after that, literally within a couple months, there is a communist uprising in Cambodia. And the Cambodian government becomes communist. Now, we, under Nixon, had already established that we're not doing another Vietnam. Like, we're not committing troops ever again like we did in Vietnam. Like Nixon doctrine, he made his own doctrine that we're not doing this anymore. So we're not going to help the Cambodian government, but they fell so quickly. Now, this is a little odd, though, because what happens is the new Cambodian government kind of wanted to, like, show the world that, yeah, that's right, communists are controlling Cambodia now. And there was an American naval vessel, like, anchored close by. It has been anchored there for a while, and before they became communists. But now that they're communists, they basically wanted to assert that Americans and non-communists are not allowed in their waters. So they took over the ship. So they took over and attacked an American vessel and took our sailors hostage. So President Ford is like, you can't do that. So he ordered airstrikes against Cambodia. And we bombed the crap out of Cambodia. And then they're like, okay, here you go. Here's your sailors back. And we're like, don't do it again. They're like, okay. So they don't do it again. But like, not the smartest thing. So if you ever decide to take over a country and there's an American ship there, just tell them to leave. Okay? Just saying, FYI, you don't want to be bombed. All right. So that is the U.S. ship Maya is. All right. In 1975, Brezhnev is going to meet with other European leaders, and Europe and the USSR are going to officially ratify their borders. And this is kind of to prevent. I mean, it seems like Brezhnev is really trying to like deter war. So officiating, gotta make him a referee, officializing, that sounds good, the borders would make sure that there is no discrepancy between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. So if they're going to argue what is really the border between like Poland and Germany, let's settle it right now so there's no way you can say that we crossed over into your land, that's why you're attacking. So if we ratify our borders and make sure everyone knows exactly where the borders are, then we can keep the peace. So it kind of seems like Brezhnev's really trying for the whole, like, keeping the peace kind of thing. So that makes us feel good. And then Mao dies, finally, in China, right? This guy's been fighting, like, since the 30s, and then finally takes over in 1949, and he dies in 1976. He's old. But there's a power struggle of who inside of China, of who's going to lead China. Now, it is Mao and Brezhnev who didn't like each other. So if Mao dies, then maybe things will be better between China and the USSR. So there's a power struggle in China. And the guy who wins is Deng Xiaoping. Now, Deng Xiaoping, he's been around for a while in China. He used to be a really good friend of Mao's, but they kind of got in a little riff when Deng was like, capitalism is like the wave of the future. Like, socialism is, like, stupid. Capitalism is what builds great nations. And Mao's like, stop it! I am Marxist! So they had, like, a kind of, like a falling out. But they still, I mean, Deng's still around. Mao never had him killed or anything. But now Deng is in control. So Deng's idea is that he wants to keep China communist so that they control all of politics, they control the media, they control all of that. But he wants to start to allow some capitalism. So he's going to allow some, like, store owners, like, to actually own the store, not just manage it and reap the profits. but it's very select. You have to apply for it. The government doesn't approve everyone. But he is going to start to allow some capitalism. He's also going to invite foreign investors to come and allow them to have Chinese workers. So Coca-Cola, Boeing are the first that go in there to establish factories there. Of course, now Apple has Apple City. But this was the first time that they allowed like foreign companies that were not communists into China to try to build up their capitalists. And then they have Macau and have all these great things today. And a lot of people think that's kind of the way Cuba's going to. Like that's probably now that Fidel is dead, right? It's like wait till Mao dies, now we can do this. Oh, Fidel's dead, and maybe we can do this. That might be where you might see Cuba going to. Retaining political, like communism, so they control the media and they control this, but maybe allowing capital. We shall see. We don't know yet. All right. So then there's an election in 1976, and after like the horribleness of the scandal with Nixon, we bring in a Washington outsider. He's never worked in D.C., not in the House, not in the Congress. We bring in Jimmy Carter. And Carter comes in, and his whole take, you see it here, is human rights over selfish interest. We should be about human rights instead of, nationalism, and he's like the polar opposite of now. All right? It really should be about that. But let's see where this takes us. So in January of 1979, we officially restore our diplomatic relations. We've been trading with China. We've had all this great things with China, but we hadn't yet officialized diplomatic relations like with the U.S. Embassy, with the Chinese Embassy here. That is going to be officialized there. During all of this time, we've been working on SALT II. Now here is our dilemma with SALT II. The Senate has to approve it, and they haven't. 7 years we work on this. So SALT I, limited to the 1972 levels. What SALT II would do is it's going to reduce the amount of weapons that we have. Here's our concern and why the Senate was so reluctant to approve it. We have a lot more missiles than the Soviet Union. Like hundreds more missiles and warheads than the Soviet Union. Huge numbers more. So if we're going to reduce it, it becomes a disadvantage to the United States and an advantage to the Soviets, because it would reduce our number of missiles. And a lot of people are leery. I mean, right now it's okay, our relationship's okay, but it could turn on a dime. Brezhnev could die, we could get crazy man, we don't know. And so why would we put ourselves in a position where we're more disadvantaged? So the Senate didn't approve a lot of the drafts of SALT, and they're going to keep going up through 1979. They're getting pretty close because they've been working on it for so long, but they haven't ratified it. It hasn't been approved yet. So then everything changes in December of 1979. A month before, in November, we have a terrible situation in Iran. A group of Iranian militants took over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Iran, and held them all hostage. The actual Ayatollah, the leader of Iran at the time, did not authorize this, but once he found out, he was like, this is great. So they hold hostages, and for whatever reason, they want to trade, blah, blah, blah. So that has our attention. So while we're like trying to negotiate with Iran to release our hostages, in December, a month later, Soviet troops and tanks roll into Afghanistan. I want to explain to you our perception. We believed that this was Soviet expansionism, that they were trying to like muscle in Afghanistan. Afghanistan had recently had a change in power and it had a new government, and we believed that they were trying to like muscle in and take over Afghanistan. That is 100% what we believed. I even put, I think, Carter's words on here somewhere, if I can find where I am. Stepping stone to their possible control over much of the world's oil. Those are our president's words. We cannot allow that. All of this like pretense about how we want peace and Brezhnev seems to be deterring everything all went down the toilet when he moved into Afghanistan. Now what is really going on in Afghanistan, and this is kind of our fault and their fault, like we should have had a better line of communication here, is this. The fairly new government of Afghanistan is not pro-communist, but they are allies of the USSR. The problem in Afghanistan is there is an uprising by a very, very radical Muslim group called the Taliban who wants to take over Afghanistan to implement Sharia law. Sharia law is incredibly strict, right? That's the one women are subordinate, that homosexuality is, punishable by death. Very strict. So that's the uprising, the Taliban. And this government that's fairly new is having a hard time dealing with this uprising, so they asked the Soviet Union for help. So the Soviet Union sent in the tanks and the troops to help the government put down the uprising. That's what's really going on. We misinterpret it into them invading Afghanistan. So we tell the Russians, or Carter tells the Russians, to get out of Afghanistan. And of course Brezhnev's like, you don't tell me what to do. And Carter's like, you need to get out of Afghanistan. And they're like, you don't tell us what to do. We want to be here. We're going to be here. Okay, again, open line of communication would have been better. Maybe we would have understood what each other's thinking here. But we interpret this to be hostility. And all bets are off now. All the work that we've done to establish a better relationship, now we're both like, I knew you couldn't be trusted. I knew you couldn't be trusted. It's back. We canceled the Russian grain deal. I can't believe you're doing this. 1980 is the Olympics. The Summer Olympics are in Moscow. You think we're going to go to Moscow? You need to understand, we boycott the 1980 Olympics, the Summer Olympics, because they are in Moscow for one reason. Whatever country hosts the Olympics, I mean, the reason they're willing to spend billions of dollars to build the arenas and the housing and all of this is because whatever country hosts the Olympics makes a killing in money. So much money. And if that's going to be Russia, what do you think they're going to do with their money? They're going to take that money, they're going to destroy Afghanistan, and then possibly move into the Middle East. There is no way we're going to support it. It is not just us. It is several countries that boycott the Olympics because they're not giving Russia any money. So, the Russian grain deal has been canceled. Like, the Cold War tension is the highest it has been since, like, probably Roosevelt. It's bad. It's very bad in Roosevelt. I should say Truman. Truman's last time there was about peace, and then, you know, kind of mellow with Nixon, but now, all gone. All gone. So, well, that's bad. Just an FYI on this Afghanistan thing. The Taliban will fight until they're ready to die to get what they want, which is Sharia law in Afghanistan. So they're not going to stop. The problem is, and most people are going to relate and compare, Afghanistan is to the Soviet Union what Vietnam was to the U.S. We went into Vietnam, a war we couldn't win, against an enemy we couldn't identify, who aren't going to stop until they get what they want. The Russians went in to face an enemy that wouldn't stop till they got what they want, that can't be identified. They're Muslim like everyone else in Afghanistan. And this war for them will rage on all through the 1980s. And FYI, the Taliban will eventually win once Russia pulls out. So there are very many similarities between the U.S. and Vietnam and the USSR in Afghanistan. But for now, tensions in the Cold War are heated. 1980 is also election year. Oh, no, I need to talk about Poland before I get to election year. So, with the Russians in Afghanistan, like, occupied, there's a group called Solidarity in Poland, Poland is under communist rule, who see this as an opportunity. If Russia is distracted in Afghanistan, now's our chance to take over the government. So a group known as Solidarity, that originally was a trade union, now they're a political group, they staged an uprising in Poland. And the president of Poland, who is communist, calls Brezhnev and says, help, I'm struggling. Like, they're fighting, I don't have enough men, I don't know what to do. And Brezhnev said, make them stop. And he's like, I'm trying, but they're fighting back. And Brezhnev's like, I'll deal with it. And so Brezhnev rolled the troops and the tanks into Poland. And they put Poland under martial law. And now Poland, literally, you couldn't be outdoors. They had mandatory curfew. And anyone caught outside could be shot. And the people of Poland were terrified, and Solidarity goes underground. Like, they're not going to oppose the Soviet Union. They're too strong. So Brezhnev used force to stop this uprising. And to America, this just proves his evilness. That he's so willing to just squash human life. So that is also election years. All of this happens in 1980. The Olympics, all of it, it's all 1980. It's also election time, and people blame Carter for many things. They blame him for the heated Cold War. They blame him for the hostages in Iran that he never got freed. They blame him for our economy being terrible. He's not going to win re-election. So the man we put in is Ronald Reagan. Oldest man ever elected, right? 69 at the time. Not a whole lot of political experience, but very charismatic, very easygoing. Someone who can probably get Democrats and Republicans to work together. They bring him in. However, you need to understand Reagan's age, 69, also means he has lived through the entire Cold War. So one of the first things he says, along with his counterpart in England, Margaret Thatcher, is he recognizes that the Soviet Union is the evil empire. So there's not going to be détente. You can't have détente with evil. And so Reagan is very staunchly anti-communist and 100% believes that the Russians are the evil empire. All right, so the problem is they're active in Afghanistan. We're not going to go into Afghanistan. It technically is like Afghans fighting Afghans, and the Russians are just there kind of like what we were in Vietnam, so it's not a UN thing. So what can I do? So what if the United States had a weapon so amazing that the Soviet Union would have no choice but do whatever we said? Now, this weapon is called the Strategic Defense Initiative. It was nicknamed Star Wars. Once I explain it to you, you may understand why. After the movie, by the way. It is probably the coolest weapon ever. Now, you have to understand that this weapon is just a theory. It's a theory that could be reality. We just don't have the technology yet. But we have the potential for the technology. So we could have this technology. We just don't have it yet. So the idea behind the SDI, or Star Wars, is that America would build these sort of like roaming satellites that would be in the atmosphere all around the Earth, constantly moving. Like they're all around the Earth. Like look, there's a Star Wars satellite. They're all around. And on board all of these satellites, there would be, and this is where we don't have the technology yet, but we could, these incredibly, again, we don't have the technology, but we could, incredibly sophisticated radar system that could detect any missile launched from anywhere on Earth, including underground silos or submerged submarines. So we would be able to detect any missile launched at us or at anyone from our roving satellites. In a moment's notice, we'd know it was there. But that's only a part of it. The rest of it is, and this is what makes this weapon so cool, on board it, again, we also don't have the technology, but we could, all of these roving satellites would also have this very cool thing called a laser. Now, this laser would be so high-tech, because again, we don't have that technology yet, that it would be able to destroy the missile and knock them out of the sky. So if they launched missiles from their submerged submarines, our Star Wars satellites would pick them up and destroy them with lasers before they could hit us. However, launching the missiles at us would then mean that we would reciprocate and launch our missiles at them, but we would have a satellite to destroy the missiles aimed at us, and they would not have a satellite to destroy the missiles aimed at them, which means we would be safe and they would be annihilated. That's the theory behind Star Wars. Not the movie, but that is why it was called Star Wars. Like, oh man, that's like totally futuristic. We don't have the technology yet, but we could. So that means we need research. You need to understand, it is going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars of research. Like, the research has to be done before we can even start building any of this, because we don't have that technology yet. America is totally on board with this. Could you imagine? It would make us unstoppable, gods among men, because no one could ever touch us again. And we're the only country that has the money to do this. Yeah, we have to borrow it, but we're good for it. Russia could never get that kind of a loan from anyone. So we start building this crazy new weapon. Well, we start the research on SDI. That's where our mentality is in the 1980s. All right. So then the Soviet Union is like, okay, so you claim you want peace on Earth, but what you really want is an America-controlled Earth. That's what you want, right? You want to be gods among men, that you control life or death, that you are the only country like this. If you don't stop building Star Wars, there can never be peace on Earth. No countries, we're all going to cower to you. It's not going to happen. So unless you stop building this, you can't expect us to ever get along. And Nick, Reagan's kind of like, well, you're the evil empire. We're never going to get along. So we're going to keep going with this. So we do. Now, the other thing that happens in 1982 is that Brezhnev dies. He is replaced by another leader who will die, who is replaced by another leader who will die. Like, you need to pick someone healthy, that's all I'm saying. So, in 1985, they finally picked someone who is not going to die. His name is Mikhail Gorbachev. We nickname him Gorby, but that's later. Right now, he's Gorbachev. We know absolutely nothing about this man. So, Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power in 1985 in the Soviet Union, and he's got all these new ideas he wants to, like, swing by the people. One of them is perestroika, which is to restructure the government, which we'll get to in a minute. The other one, the one that was very intriguing, was glasnost, and it means openness. So Gorbachev goes to the people of Russia, and he's like, look, I need you guys to tell me what the problems of Russia are. Like, the only way we can fix Russia's problems are if you guys tell me what the problems are. So there you go ahead, tell me the problems, tell me what the problems Russia's having, and everyone's like, it's a trick. Like, he wants all the people who are unhappy to come out so he can just shoot them, right? Right? That's not something Lenin would, that's not something Stalin would do. So everyone's like, no, we're good. And he's like, no, I'm serious. Like, if you don't tell me what the problems are, then how am I going to fix them? So people aren't sure what to make of Gorbachev. So they're kind of like, so finally, you know, a few people are going to be like, I really think irrigation's wrong because we don't really have irrigation. Please don't shoot me. And he's like, see, that's what I mean, irrigation. And then within a few months, there's this huge irrigation project that is started. And people were like, it's a trick though. He's like, I'm going to do one real nice thing. And then all the other people come out, the dissenters will come out, and then I have to shoot them all, right? But then, like, more months go by, and he starts doing, like, all of these things that people are saying they are unhappy with, and he's trying, and things he can't do, he's like, I'm sorry, that's something I can't do. Oh, you're not going to shoot me? Like, oh, okay. Like, and so the whole world's kind of like we don't, Russia, right? The U.S. again. And Reagan's like, don't trust them. Like, totally don't, like, crocodile tears. You can't trust, no, I don't think so. So he and Gorbachev actually meet in 1986 in Iceland. It's not random. There's a summit meeting in Iceland. They weren't just like, oh, let's go to Iceland. And they're talking, and Reagan's kind of like, he's kind of cool. Like, Gorbachev's kind of cool. But, I don't know. And Gorbachev's like, I have no problem reopening détente, reopening negotiations, doing all of this. But you have to understand, if you expect other countries to talk peace with you, you have to abandon Star Wars. Like, you can't continue to build this weapon that's going to make you a god and think that we can ever be on equal terms on anything. And Reagan's like, no, it's not going to happen. And Gorbachev's like, okay. So Gorbachev goes home, and he starts allowing some civil rights. He starts allowing people to express their dissatisfaction with the government so that he can restructure and fix it. He starts allowing some media to, like, go uncensored. Like, the communists don't control it. And Reagan's like, this guy's for real. So we're up to about 1987 now. And people, like congressmen, are coming up to Reagan and saying, just to let you know, Star Wars is really costing a lot of money. Like, you need to understand, our national debt in 1980 was $900 billion. That means every president from George Washington all the way through Carter had accumulated a $900 billion debt. 4 years later, in 1984, it was $2 trillion. 4 years later, it's going to be $3 trillion. So it doubled in 4 years because of Star Wars. It's so expensive, the research that has to go into trying to develop this technology. And yes?
Did it contribute to inflation?
It's absolutely going to contribute to inflation, but inflation was already really high. So initially, it went down, and then it slowly comes back up. So it goes, all right. Good question. Yes?
Did anyone think, was anybody, reasonably, this is not going to work?
I think
What was the public?
Initially, like in the first few years, the public is 100% for it. Because we saw Brezhnev's action in Poland and in Afghanistan as hostile. And this would be like you got to protect your family first. So if we have a weapon that can protect our family, that's fantastic. But I think once we get to 1986 and 87, and they're like, hey, why don't we spend more money on, like, welfare? It's like, oh, we can't because all our money's going to Star Wars, and people are kind of like, And even by 1987, Congress is like, we just can't afford to fund. Like, the research is going too slow. It's costing us way too much money. And then you got to understand that Reagan's kind of like looking at all the stuff going on in the Soviet Union going, but he's also doing some really, really cool stuff. So by the time we get to 1988, Reagan has invited Gorbachev to the U.S. They have met. And, I mean, Reagan was a likable guy anyways, and apparently Gorbachev was too, and they, like, totally hit it off. And then Gorbachev invited Reagan to go to Moscow, and he'll be the first president to visit communist Russia. And he goes, they hang out. Towards the end of Reagan's presidency, people said, now whether this is true or not, I don't know, this is just what people said. Remember the hotline? That Kennedy, Khrushchev, we have to have a hotline?
Yeah.
That Reagan and Gorbachev would be like, what are you going to do today? And that they had like become friends. And FYI, Gorbachev came to Reagan's funeral. Like, I know, it's very sweet. So, hence, I did happen in third hour too. Hence, our nickname for Gorbachev is Gorby. Okay, so other stuff is happening though in 1988 going into 1989. So, with Gorbachev's new policy, he's also going to strike down the Brezhnev Doctrine, which I think is already on there somewhere. He repealed the Brezhnev Doctrine. The Brezhnev Doctrine, which was by Brezhnev a very long time ago, committed the USSR to basically protecting all the Eastern Bloc countries, where if they were having internal problems, that, like Poland did, that would give the USSR authority to go in there. And so Gorbachev repeals it and says, if you're having a problem, it's your business. You got to take care of it. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria. It's not my business to control your country. And so Solidarity in Poland saw this as a green light. If the Russians are still going to be distracted in Afghanistan, which they still are, and Gorbachev is apparently making it known that he's not going to interfere in other countries' internal problems, now's our chance. So in 1989, Solidarity uprises again in Poland. The president of Poland once again calls Russia. This time he talks to Gorbachev, and he's like, I need help. They're uprising again. I need you to come in here, storm in here. And Gorbachev's like, nope. You're on your own. And the president of Poland's like, you can't do this to me. He's like, oh, yes, I can. It's your country. And so the president gets really mad and resigns. And so then a new president takes over. It's been bloodshed in Poland. And so the new president ends up calling a truce with Solidarity. And here's basically what they ended up doing back then, is they decided to make a Congress made of two houses. One house controlled by the communists, and one house is elected by the people. And in order to pass a law, both houses had to agree. So the communists didn't completely relinquish control, but they also allowed an equal amount of people control. And so that kind of solved the problems in Poland, but Poland was just the first. After that, you have your list there of all the countries that had uprisings. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, all toppled their communist governments, and Gorbachev did nothing because he said it wasn't his place to do anything anymore. Oh, heart Gorbachev. All right, so then students in China begin protesting. Now, this is a different world. So Gorbachev is actually invited, this was even before the students started protesting, he was invited to go speak in China. So he went to whichever university it was. I don't remember if he was in Beijing or Shanghai. He's in one of the big ones, though. And he's addressing all of the students, telling them that, you know, you shouldn't disagree with your communist government, but you should tell them things you want changed. Because that's what he did, right? He didn't get rid of the communist government. He just accepted input from the public. And then he leaves. And the students are like, yeah, let's do it. So they start telling the government what they should do. We want democracy. We want all of this. So the government, Deng Xiaoping was all about, right, capitalism, but communist control. They had to squash it. So they killed the student protest leader. So like some 20-year-old kid. And gunned him down. And so what ended up happening is the students fell into mourning for him. Now there is a statue in Tiananmen Square that is known for people going when they're in mourning. And so a lot of students started like gathering around to mourn this gunned down leader's death. And then more came, and then to honor their fallen leader, they turned the mourning into a protest for democracy. And within months you had 1 million students. That'd be like almost all of Las Vegas protesting. So Deng Xiaoping and the hardliners in China, if you're going to keep control, only one way to do it. So they sent in the military. It is known as the Tiananmen Square Massacre. and hundreds are killed. There's a great video of a tank rolling into the city. I know you've seen this video, and the like little skinny Asian guy standing in front of it, and the tank turns, and the kid goes like this, and the tank turns this way, and the kid goes like this. But it was their protest. It was also their last protest. They haven't protested like this since. It was a massacre in Tiananmen Square. All right. After Reagan's presidency, George Bush becomes president, but there's all kinds of crazy things happening we got to talk about the Berlin Wall. All right. So George Bush does become president in 1989. Now let's talk about Berlin. So 1989 marks East Germany's 40th anniversary, I think, official, or 45th, something like that. Whatever the case may be, it's an anniversary of East Germany. They invited Gorbachev to come speak. Gorbachev shows up to speak, and people are like cheering for him. And then the president of East Germany was like, I'm going to need your help. I've been hearing talk about a protest like there has been in all these other places. And he's like, you need to listen to the people. You need to give the people what they want. And then he left. And so then the people rose up, and the president was like, no, my country, you're not allowed to do this. And the people were like, we want democracy. And he was like, forget you all. And so then he resigns. And then, so the new president's like, hey man, Hakuna Matata. So the new president decides that he is going to give the people what they want, because what do they want? They want the Berlin Wall torn down. So he opens the gate for the Berlin Wall. This is in November of 1989. And people from East and West Berlin are united for the first time in, 40 whatever years. And it's very symbolic, right? Because remember, the reason the Berlin Wall was built as a symbol that there were never peace between us, and the Berlin Wall is falling. So it's very symbolic. But in the meantime, there are issues in Russia. Oh wait, I got to talk about the Velvet Revolution. Oh, we're not going to make it to the whole thing. But I can't not talk about the Velvet Revolution. Yeah. It's like the best. So I told you about all these uprisings. They're all bloody. But now we have to talk about Czechoslovakia and the Velvet Revolution. So you felt velvet. So here's what happens in Czechoslovakia. So all these governments are, all these people are protesting in all these countries, and they're getting slaughtered by the government. And the students of Czechoslovakia are like, we should do it too. They're like, yeah. So they stage this totally peaceful protest with like signs, like, we want democracy too. And the police show up, and the police are like, what are we supposed to do? Like, we've never had a protest. They're like, I don't know. Like, everyone else is like beating the crap out of them. So they're like, go home. And the kids are like, no. And they're like, well, then you're going to be arrested. And they're like, no. So they arrest them, and a couple of them resisted, so they got beat up a little bit, and then they all got thrown in jail, and the next day they all got lit up. And then the students were like, we need to like get more input on this. So they held town hall meetings like all throughout Czechoslovakia, open to the public. This is the communist country, remember? And so people would show up and be like, what should we do? And they're like, we should have a strike, like a nationwide strike. Like the whole country should go on strike at the same time. So like, that's brilliant, but that'll also hurt our employers. Like, I know that's bad. And we won't get paid, that's bad too. But this is a way where the whole country can do something. So they're like, okay. So they agreed to have an entire country strike. So the entire country went on strike for 2 hours. And they all dutifully went back to work. That was nice. And so then, after this strike, the president, the communist president, was like, I have heard you. I've decided I'm going to resign, but I don't want you guys to have like no leader and then there's chaos. So what I'll do is I'll resign and then have like a temporary president, and we'll schedule an election so you guys can vote. And the people are like, okay. And so he officially resigns and has like this temporary guy who's like, I'm just here till you guys pick the right guy that you want. They had an election and they voted their guy in. All the other countries are like, you call that a revolution? They're like, yes, a revolution, a change in political. So cute. Then I have to tell you about the Velvet Divorce. So like when countries split up like into two countries, there's usually like a war. So what happened with Czechoslovakia is you have the Czech people and the Slovakian people that were one country, right? They would meet in Congress, and then you could tell that they always disagreed on things. And they were like, you know what would be better if we were like two countries? And they're like, yeah. So they just split up into two countries. And the rest of the world, like we went to civil war for that. Like, how does that? They're like, oh. We have very little left. We have very little left. And I don't have time to finish now because the bell's going to ring like now. We're close, though. It's almost over. We almost made it. See, I missed the Dante.